We've already opened up the class talking about a handful of language things we need to know. Terminology like framing, lighting, background, etc. So let's talk a little bit more about some different language things we can use, some different parts of the vocabulary we can add when we're talking about analyzing photographs, talking about what's good and what's not in photographs. So to start off with, let's talk a little bit about magic hour. Magic hour is something that we'll use when we're talking about photographs, in the sense that you can say, hey, a photograph is really great if it's taken during magic hour, or this looks like it was taken during magic hour. And this is also just a good suggestion for you who have the ability to go out and plan some stuff you're doing for your photo stories. Magic hour, you actually get 2 of them per day, and it is the roughly hour-long period of time between dawn and dusk. So it is sort of as the sun has gone down, but before it is fully dark, or as it is light, but before the sun has fully crossed the horizon. So it's either at the horizon line or lower. And so again, just based on science, we get 2 of those per day. And the reason why it's called magic hour is because it's known for being a really good period of time for really great lighting. So you get really good, splendid colors out of the sky. The lighting on people's faces allows you to do a combination of full sun shots as well as silhouetting and profile shots. And it just avoids a lot of the problems that harsh sunlight can have in the photography process. So you get nice, warm, glowing colors in your white balance that often helps set a scene or can help tell part of the story. Like it works for if you're taking pictures of farm work. It's really great to be out during magic hour. But just in general, if you want to go take some nice pictures of your friends or take a nice picture of some landscape, some of the best times during the day to do it are during what we call magic hour. So that again, that's the 2 hours during the day that we have in the morning when it's light but before the sun has come up, and in the evening when it's still light but after the sun has gone over the horizon. The next piece of terminology is juxtaposition. Juxtaposition may be a fancy vocabulary word that you had in elementary vocab classes, or maybe in a spelling test this one may have come up. But juxtaposition is the pairing of 2 things which contrast each other or have opposite elements. And in photography, we're using the same thing. It is a photographic presentation of opposing or contrasting elements which convey a sense of irony. So we're being ironic. It conveys things that don't necessarily either belong together or that have some sort of deeper message by being next to each other. A really classic example of this is a photograph from the Great Depression, where you have folks lined up in a bread line or a food sustenance line where they were waiting for canned food and bread, and then they're lined up in front of a poster of folks in a car, and it has the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way on it. So this is juxtaposition because it's folks waiting for bread during a massive Great Depression, some of the hardest hit economic areas in the whole country, sort of lining up in front of this big poster that's saying, hey, it's so wonderful, the highest standard of living, buy this car. Another one from the Great Depression, the folks who are hiking from town to town to try to find some sort of work, agricultural laborers, and they walk by this highway where on the right-hand side there is a billboard saying, next time try the train, relax. Advertising for the Southern Pacific Railroad for travelers, say, hey, take the train. Of course, this is juxtaposition because these are folks who are migrant workers next to a billboard saying to relax and take the train. A more modern example would be, this is a photograph that was used quite a bit in the mid-90s into the 2000s as an example. This is a homeless woman with her kid outside of a bank, a city bank. And so the juxtaposition of homelessness with a major economic institution creates a juxtaposition in the photograph. Next is mood. Mood is a little bit less tangible. Mood is a little bit less something that we can clearly define. Juxtaposition is easy to clearly define in the actual subjects and the actual elements of the photograph. Mood is a little bit trickier. So we're going to call mood the process of a photo's ability to change someone's state of mind or someone's emotions while they're viewing it. It's almost a way of conveying a sense of change of emotion based on a number of different things that can impact mood. Mood is a really tricky one to define when we're talking about photography. But let's just look through some examples. So mood can be impacted by something like lighting. So we have this photograph, which is a darker around the edges photograph. You see that the light is coming from spotlights that are pointing towards this car, which is stuck in a river during a flood, or the overflowed area of a river during a flood. And you can see the firefighters coming in from the right-hand side with a bucket on the end of the ladder truck, checking the car to make sure there's no people in it, or to rescue people that may be potentially in it. The reason that I use this as an example for mood is that it is a dark photograph where the only light comes in through spotlights. And because it's contextually a very stressful thing, it creates sort of a stressful mood or a dark mood to how it conveys that sense of emotion. Color can do it as well, or the absence of color. So this is a very dreary photograph. This is a photograph from the ongoing insurgencies in Iraq. And we've got a severe lack of color. We've got dirt and rocks in the background that are all sort of a tan color. The sky is completely blackened out by the smoke from the fire that's happening off to the right-hand side in the background. The individuals are not wearing anything particularly bright on their uniforms. It's all sort of the same drab color. So the absence of color in this sets a very dreary mood. In the same way that the first picture set kind of a dreary mood by the lack of light, this one does it by the lack of color. Sometimes the action itself can set mood. So here, this is sort of a medium lit cathedral. There's a medium amount of color. Everything's got some pop and color from the white of the incense smoke, but just the action itself of the smoke lingering in the air, the little bit of a high shutter speed shot to get that smoke coming out of the incense burner to start with, but it does set more of a tranquil mood, more of a sense of tranquility. So if we combine things like a lack of light or lots of light, color or lack of color, an action or lack of action, we can sort of look at even just a simple photograph of someone waiting on the train to go home after work for the day and say that, okay, well, what can we spot here that sets the mood? Well, it's low lighting because we get sort of a silhouetted shot of him. All the lighting is over on the other side of the platform. There's not just a whole lot of color going on. There's a little bit of color in the trees in the background over the sign, a little on the sign, but otherwise it's pretty dreary. And there's not a whole lot of action. The guy's just sitting there reading his phone. So you get a mood of, hey, this is probably after a long work day, and this guy's coming home. Another thing that's a little bit harder to define, sort of like mood, and mood can play a part of this, is what we'll call sense of place. So how well does the photo or the photo stories convey a sense of where this is actually taking place? Let's call it the ability of a photo to convey contextual and context understanding of where a photo is taking place. And this can be important when the place is part of the story, or the setting is part of the story that you're trying to tell. So for your photo story, if you're working on someone who works in a particular restaurant, or works in an interesting job, thinking back to the example of someone who works in a garage, works in a mechanic shop, the setting is just as much as part of the story as the actions and the people. For examples here, I ended up grabbing a photo story that I really like about a town in Spain that maintains its traditional construction. It's out in the rolling hills in the center part of Spain. And the photo story is about the place. And so it's got photos like this, which are these sort of stark white square buildings that have been built up on the ledges of this hillside. The contrast between the white walls and the darker windows really sets an interesting component of it. I love that you can see the little stairs on the spiral stairs on the upper left-hand corner. The antennas for television make it look lived in. But overall, you get to a sense of the place of it. The interesting uniqueness of this place is a part of why this photo is interesting. From the same photo story, you have the women in the town, a lot of them who wear traditional outfits, and in Spain this means sort of a long black gown with a sort of a black veil type thing. But the again, the sort of color and juxtaposition and the color and contrast between the white walls and the black gowns helps, again, sort of create a sense of place, lets you know that this is, adds to the sense that this is a very traditional town. There's this photo, which I like, which is, of course, a bull with its horns out, which is a very Spanish thing. But it's in the middle, for some reason, in the middle of this pathway, this alleyway, in Spain, in this town. And it's sort of looking back to the photographer. Makes me a little bit nervous. It makes you sort of wonder if this is going to start running at you at any moment. But again, it sort of adds to the uniqueness of it. This is a very iconic animal for the country of Spain, and so to have it in one of the shots in this city is important. And then finally, just to sort of give a sense of where this is all at, you have again the white walls, part of the defining factor of the sense of place on the left, and then over the right you have the very dry rolling hills of central Spain, and the clouds in the sky. Both work together to convey a sense of, this is the environment where this takes place. This is the sort of rural hilltop town that exists. So now let's go back to a little bit more of a nuts and bolts style point of vocabulary to learn when we're talking about photography, and that's called point of entry. Now, unlike stuff like mood and sense of place, which are a little bit less tangible, point of entry is more specific. Point of entry is, where is the single spot on the photograph that your eye immediately catches? That when you first are shown the photograph, here's where your eyeball darts to. Here's where you first pay attention to. And that's really important, because when we start talking about the way that a photograph is set up, the way it is structured in its composition, where the eye goes first is incredibly important. I've probably already used point of entry already in this class, talking about other photographs, but just to clarify what that means, this is it. This is a photograph of someone playing a clarinet at a street festival in San Francisco. And here's another point. Everybody's point of entry may be slightly different. This point of entry kind of has to be a best guess for sometimes for analysis purposes. So we have to sort of think about, well, where is it going to be roughly? Well, for me, the point of entry of this is the end of the clarinet. It being bright red sets it apart from the rest of the photograph. And from there, you sort of trace the photograph back down to the woman's fingers who's playing it, then back down her arms to the rest of the photograph. But when we're talking about point of entry, it is where your eyeball goes first. And for me, it is the end of the clarinet, the bright red sort of end of the horn section. Now, some people have looked at this in previous classes and said that their point of entry is actually her watch that she has on. I actually don't really know. I hadn't thought about it that way. For me, it was the end of the clarinet. Here's someone working in a cranberry bog up in New England. And for me, the point of entry of this photograph is the person. It's the silhouette of the person in the water, because it stands out from the brightness of the water so much. And the fact that the rest of the photograph with the cranberries is kind of all the same thing. It's the same pattern. And then right in the middle, you have this disturbance, this thing that doesn't quite belong. And that's where your eyeball goes first. Here's another photograph from that photo story about that city in Spain. For me, the point of entry is the donkey's ears that are sort of poking up over this wall, kind of comically. I like this photograph a lot, but it's a good example of point of entry, because when you're first shown this photograph, you have these two ears that are poking up over this wall on a white background. That's where your eyeball hits first. That's what you're seeing first. So when you're thinking about, as you line shots up, you're thinking about your editing of your shots, point of entry is an important factor. Impact. Impact is another of the sort of intangibles. It's kind of like mood. An impact is if a photograph can provoke, if it has an immediate, powerful, or an emotional response from the viewer. So does it make you feel something immediately? Unlike mood, where you have to sort of contemplate it for a little bit, impact is going to be something that makes you immediately get a sense of place or immediately have a reaction. Sometimes this can be because of the action of the shot itself. So a shot where something has clearly impacted the dirt in front of these folks and kicked the dirt up into the air, and the shutter speed is sharp enough and is fast enough to catch that dirt in the air and the bullet casings off to the right, you get a sense that this is a very hectic scene. And so the impact of the photograph is a sense of sort of nervousness or hecticness, of understanding that this is a live, active situation. This is a photograph of firefighters rescuing a girl who was in a overflowing creek or overflowing river. And you get another sense of impact, right? Because of the action involved. It's stressful. You can tell from the faces of both of the subjects in the photograph that this is a stressful situation. From the way that the water is moving around her, you get a sense that this is very strong moving water. The way that he is secured with the belts, this is a very serious situation and creates an immediate feeling of suspense. So the first photograph was about action, the second one is about suspense, but impact can happen in a way that doesn't require action. It can be something like this, which is a photograph of a children's hospital, namely for children who have cancer, and this is Halloween in that hospital. So they let the kids dress up and go and do trick-or-treating around the rest of the hospital. This is a little kid dressed as Captain America, and he's got his IV machine and his IVs to the sort of with him as he goes around trick-or-treating. And of course, this is a very emotional setting. This is a setting that will have quite a bit of a either uplifting or depressing emotional impact to it. So it doesn't have to all be action. It can be the context of the story itself or the setting of the story itself. Foreground and background. This is just something I want to bring up and more or less clarify than anything else. I've used this in these terminologies before in describing stuff, but I want to just clarify a little bit. Foreground and background, dominant foregrounds and informational backgrounds can provide context to pictures, but foreground and background are simply the foreground is what is close to you, the background is what is far away. It doesn't matter what's in focus. Sometimes the background is going to be what's in focus, sometimes the foreground is going to be what's in focus, but that doesn't change what they are in the actual building of the photograph itself. So two photographs, this is another one from that photo story of the small town in Spain. The city in the background is sharp and in focus. The folks in the foreground, sort of dressed traditionally, are out of focus, but it's still, the foreground is the people, the background is the city. In the same way that the foreground is the person, because he's the closest thing to the camera. The background is the window that has had a bullet shot into it. Even though the windshield is only a few feet away from him, it's still the background. So foreground is what's close, background is what's far away. And finally, one last point here is bokeh. Bokeh is one of the funnier ones, word-wise. And bokeh is essentially, just to define it with a quotation here, it's the orbs created when lights are out of focus and in an image. It's a neat effect to have in the background of a photo created through wide apertures. So we know that aperture is a measurement of how wide or how narrow the shutter opens when it opens. And we know that when you have a low number, so a low f-stop, that means that the lens is opening wider. It means that something like an f1.4 means that the lens is opening as wide as it can. And when it does that, it lets in lots and lots of light, and it changes the focal point. It changes where the thing in front of you is going into focus. So that oftentimes with really, really, really low aperture, which means a really wide opening in the lens, or in the shutter, that the thing that's close to you gets very, very sharp and in focus, and everything else in the background is out of focus. Now, bokeh is used to describe the shape of light and essentially the shape of the stuff that's out of focus in the background. Light, as it passes through a lens and into a shutter and onto a sensor, when it's out of focus, it naturally creates orbs. It creates little circles or balls just kind of based on the way light works. And so this is an example of how bokeh can look. All of this is out of focus, but if you notice, the closer that the things out of focus are, the more distinguished that the lights look, the more almost sharp that they look, even though they are out of focus, versus the ones in the far background. And what talking about the bokeh will mean for you is something like, hey, if you're taking a photograph of someone with low aperture outside at night, you're going to get either very distinguished bokeh or indistinguished bokeh. This is a photograph of both. The layer of lights that are roughly at the subject's eye level, so if you take where her eyes are at and you go left and right across the photo, you'll see very distinguished bokeh because the individual orbs are very clear. You can see the lines on the edge of the orb. But everywhere else, down on what I'm guessing is the sidewalk or up in the sky, you can see that the lines are not nearly as clear. They're much, much more blurry, which means it's very undistinguished bokeh. So that's the difference between distinguished or sharp bokeh and undistinguished bokeh. And again, it's all just essentially saying what shape is the stuff that's out of focus in your picture. And that's not necessarily something that you think of a lot of times. If the subject is close to you, you snap a picture and that's what you want. You don't care about what's back there, but when we're thinking about how good a photograph can look, the shape or the style that the bokeh is in, all that stuff out of focus behind the subject, that actually ends up being really important. So these are just a handful of extra vocab words that we can use when talking about the quality of photographs, what makes them good, and how we can improve them.